Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to David's Den. I am David and I make videos about Stephen King, his novels, his short stories, and any adaptations that were made for film or television. We have finally reached the end of our night shift journey. It has been 9 months. We have read 20 short stories, watched 12 episodes of television, listened to 8 podcast episodes, watched 7 feature-length films and 6 short films, and with this video, we have made 43 videos for YouTube chronicling the short story collection by Stephen King published in 1978, Night Shift. Links to all of my reading and movie vlogs and podcast, what I'm calling movie-ish vlogs for Strawberry Spring, are down in the description below. In this video, I'm going to be ranking the stories in Night Shift. Now, I do want to say this is my personal opinion. Okay, you're allowed to disagree with me. I do want to say first off that there are no bad stories in Night Shift, really. There's a few that I was really kind of not happy with. I wouldn't necessarily want to read again, but they weren't badly written. So I want to dispel that. I don't want, when I reveal number 20, the worst story in Night Shift, in my opinion, it's still a good story. So let's just get that out of the way. I'm going to be doing this as best I can with no spoilers. I may go off on some tangents, but my outline that I am working from doesn't have any spoilers included. So we will see how this goes. In my ranking, I considered literary elements as well as the enjoyment value of each story. So I'm going to try to be fair. If something was a really good, well-written story with resonant themes that maybe I just didn't click with, I want to be fair about that. I'm going to try to make all of this very quick. If you know my other videos, you know that's probably not going to happen, but I'm going to try. I have outlined 6 quick points for each story, and then I am moving on to the next one. I'm going to be telling you when it was originally published, if there was any adaptation, what the basic premise is, any sort of comments I may have on structure or themes from a literary standpoint. I want to talk about the enjoyment factor as a reader reading the story, and then I'm going to throw in 1 or 2 of my favorite quotes from each story, maybe because I just love the language that Stephen King uses, or maybe because it's a quote that really encapsulates that story. Here we go. Number 20. The Lawn Mower Man. Stephen King has admitted that he wrote this when he was only 16 years old, and that it was published in Cavalier magazine in May 1975. In 1992, it was made into a not so faithful adaptation as a film with Pierce Brosnan and Jeff Fahey, directed by Brett Leonard. Stephen King actually sued to have his name taken off. It was originally called Stephen King's The Lawn Mower Man, and he said, no, this resembles nothing like what I wrote. But we are not here to talk about the adaptations. There are entire videos about that and watch-alongs over on Patreon. The short story is about Harold Parkett. He's a man whose yard has gotten overgrown after the boy that used to mow it has gone off to college. And the mower broke the year before, so he couldn't do it himself. So Harold Parkett calls a yard service to tend to his overgrown lawn, and when they show up, the lawnmower actually drives itself, while the lawnmower man, replete with cloven hooves, eats the cut grass, flying behind the mower, and cries out, "By Circe!" It's kind of a crazy premise. I mean, it's weird. It's kind of a what the f did I just read kind of fun story. There are some problems with it. It's a little skeevy with the way he thinks about his daughter and her dates and her breasts in the sweater, so be prepared for that. There's some odd detours and these jarring intellectual references, kind of that young writer trap of a 16-year-old saying, look how smart I am and look at the illusions that I can make. So these are kind of some structural issues that I have with it. But I think the theme is a fear of change. It may have just been a gross story, but it's an intriguing idea. I think it could be fleshed out and smoothed out a little bit, and it could be a really great story. And one of my favorite quotes, and this is just because it's so sensory, you just know that you're there. The overripe smell of cut grass hung in the air like sour wine. 19. The Mangler. The Mangler was originally published in Cavalier magazine in May 1975. You're actually going to see a little pattern. developed. Somebody over at Cavalier really liked Stephen King. A great number of these stories were originally published in that magazine. And then in 1995, it was made into a movie starring Tobe Hooper, Robert Englund, Freddy Krueger himself, and it was directed by Tobe Hooper, who did the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and we have already discussed one of his films on this channel because he did the 1979 miniseries of Salem's Lot, and that's actually going to come back later on. In The Mangler, there's a series of terrible accidents that happen at a industrial laundromat. Officer Hunton from the police detective unit is called in to investigate this laundry. And the steam ironer for sheets, this big kind of, I think it's described as like 10 feet long, or I'll look up the exact measurements and put it here. There's a quote from the book, but it's nicknamed the Mangler, and it gets possessed by random chance occurrences that all add up to a spell which actually conjures a demon. So the themes are about random chance and that fate may be in control. And the things that we are facing may be different than what we think they are because of our limited perspectives. Mark's characterization is great. He's kind of the Stephen King stand-in. He is the friend / English teacher of this detective, of Detective Hunton, and he just conveniently knows all about the occult for no logical reason based in character. Although the characterization as a person is great, this just doesn't makes sense. So there's some eye roll worthy moments and items that happen in The Mangler. It's kind of an unbelievable premise, and it didn't really get any believable support in the story. I will say that The Mangler is just silly, gruesome fun, and one of my favorite quotes, she looked utterly flabbergasted, utterly shocked, as if a priest had given her communion and then slapped her. Number 18, Trucks. Trucks was originally published in Cavalier magazine, again, in June of 1973. In 1986, it was made into a movie called Maximum Overdrive that was written and directed by a very cocaine-fueled Stephen King. It's kind of a mess, but it's a lot of fun. It stars Emilio Estevez, Pat Hingle, and Yardley Smith. In the story, the short story that is, not the changes for the film Maximum Overdrive, trucks have become sentient and they want revenge, I guess. It's kind of unclear why they're trying to kill everyone, but they are. The themes are very kind of common, man versus machine, our creations taking over. What I will say is that Stephen King, unlike The Mangler, he calls out that it's a stupid premise, and therefore we as the reader are free to just go along for the ride. There's actually a quote where he says the wheels turned themselves. You couldn't think about it too much. You'd go insane if you thought about it too much. It's kind of a clue to the reader. Don't fucking think about it. Just go with the story and it's going to be fun. There are some racial issues with the way that Stephen King depicts a short order cook who happens to be black. Stephen King himself has said that at the beginning of his career, he was not very good at depicting certain racial groups or different groups of people like the LGBTQ plus community, and he's apologized for it. So I don't want to harp on this too much, but I do want to acknowledge that the problem is there. It's a silly story, but when you actually stop and reflect on it for a while, this sat with me more than I thought it would. It's actually kind of frightening. I have a few favorite quotes from this. The first one being, they needed to know only one thing about their late masters, and they knew it. We bleed. Out here, the rumble of trucks was louder, more menacing, the sound of beasts. From inside, it was a movie. Out here, it was real. You could get killed. I just love that kind of differentiation of when you feel safe and when you don't. And the author cluing us into, we have moved into dangerous territory. King is wonderful about building suspense, and here is a very early example of it. Number 17, I Know What You Need. I Know What You Need was originally published in Cosmopolitan magazine in September of 1976, and it's kind of weird that it was published in a magazine geared toward women when it's really about a stalker and very uncomfortable kind of a story. There are no adaptations that I could find. I did hear on one of my Stephen King podcasts recently in the last year or so, I don't remember who it was, but that there is one in development, so I'm really excited for that to happen. And as soon as I have access to it, I will try to do a watch-along vlog for you. I Know What You Need is about a college student named Elizabeth. She takes up with this guy named Ed Hamner, and Ed always kind of seems to know just what Elizabeth wants or needs, just as she wants or needs it. What she needs help from her friends to realize is that she actually has met Ed before, and he is not good news. The themes are very clearly examining dangers of trusting people too easily or too readily, kind of falling too hard for someone, right? Maybe after that first date and your mind starts racing of the possibilities. It examines false or misplaced trust or the sense of security that maybe we place in something we shouldn't. I would say a good way to think of this is if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. It is told in a third-person narrative. I do think it could have been a little more immediate in the first-person narrative if we were seeing things from Elizabeth's point of view. And while Elizabeth is our protagonist and that's who we follow and we do get her point of view, I just think writing it in first person would have made this a much stronger story. It did drag just a little bit in some of the background information. I think we could have cut some of it, but ultimately it's fun. It's dark enough to be unsettling, but there's some far-fetched ideas that are hard to swallow or that kind of come out of nowhere, especially as we get toward the end, without being set up or hinted at or foreshadowed in some way to support the twist at the end earlier in the story. Some quotes I love just because of the beauty of the language. She began to weep again and staggered a little with the unexpected force of it. Then he was holding her. And then it was all right. Number 16, Battleground. Battleground was published in Cavalier in September of 1972, and I must say it might be one of my personal favorite stories, but it's not as thematic, not as intricate as things later on the list. And while I wanted to place it higher, this is just where I think it fits. It was turned into a television episode. It was the pilot episode of the 2006 TNT limited series Nightmares and Dreamscapes from the stories of Stephen King. The episode starred William Hurt, and it was directed by Brian Henson. And what's really interesting here is there is not one bit of spoken dialogue in the entire film. And it's so well done, or TV episode, not film. Battleground is about this professional assassin who has to battle a battalion of toy soldiers that come alive after they're enchanted by the mother of this assassin's latest victim, who happened to be the CEO of a toy company. Really what Stephen King was examining was war, nuclear power, disproportionate devastation. Stephen King was very much entrenched in the political sphere and activism in the 60s and 70s and was a very outspoken opponent of Vietnam. And this story really is a comment on people looking the other way during Vietnam, the people that weren't protesting and demanding that we end the war, people that were okay with what was happening because it wasn't affecting them. But this really only becomes a theme or a thing, if you will, on the last page. It does put the theme into perspective and it does make sense with the overall story, but it feels kind of shoehorned in at the end there just to give the story some literary weight. So I have to kind of cringe at that structural element. But ultimately the story is so much fun. The battle is thought out. The story is visceral. You feel like things are being fired at you. There's the part where he gets out on the ledge and walks from window to window in this high-rise building, and you feel that height, that feeling of maybe I could fall off at any minute. It's just a fun story. And then it gets kind of twisted at the end by imposing a meaning that doesn't really reflect the rest of the story. There was a blinding sizzle of yellow fire, and a sudden gout of wood and plaster exploded from the wall to his left. A rocket launcher? They had a goddamn rocket launcher, and a direct hit would tear his head off. Damn it, that wasn't even listed on the box. 15. Quitters, Inc. Quitters, Inc. was previously unpublished before the Night Shift collection, and it was adapted into the first of 3 segments in a 1985 film called Cat's Eye. The movie was directed by Louis Teague, and this segment starred James Woods. Of course, the film was produced by huge 80s and 90s King producer Dina De Laurentiis, who actually also did Maximum Overdrive that we've already talked about based on trucks. In the story, Dick Morrison enlists the assistance of a company that uses these mob-style tactics as aversion therapy to help him quit smoking cigarettes. There's a lot more to it that I'm not going to get into because it's a fun journey and it would be too spoiler heavy. The plot is what you're there for reading this story. It's a quick exploration of addiction, and what is important to us, the things that are important to us, like your wife, your kid, your career, how your addictions might affect them, and how difficult it is to overcome addiction. It's a straight narrative. There's really nothing special about the way it's written. There's some gripping language, of course. It's Stephen King. Great character building. But ultimately, the story is just fun. It's relatable to anyone who has had any sort of addiction or even habit that they wanted to break. As a former smoker, I felt his desperation from beginning to end. And also as a former smoker, when people say, well, why don't you just quit? I love this quote. Non-smokers could afford to be smug. Unlock this door or I'll have the cops on you before you can say Marlboro Man. 14. The Ledge. The Ledge was published in Penthouse magazine in July of 1976 and is actually the second segment in Cat's Eye. It stars Robert Hayes and also Kenneth McMillan, who we saw as Sheriff Gillespie in the 1979 Salem's Lot, directed by Toby Hooper. Our protagonist in The Ledge, Stan Norris, taught tennis lessons and had an affair with one of his students, very tropey for the 70s, but that student happened to be the wife of a mobster type, Kressner. Kressner makes a wager with Stan that he can keep his wife, Marcia, and an additional $20,000, but only if he can walk around the little 5-inch ledge that surrounds the building at the penthouse level, 43 floors up. Obviously, Stephen King is exploring a fear of heights and this idea that life isn't fair, because we have this recurring theme, this motif of a bet versus a wager, and how a gentleman wagers, but always hedges his bets. The story is extremely visceral. I had that feeling of I was about to fall a number of times. It taps into that kind of primal place of self-preservation, and it is highly successful in that regard, if not the best example of literature. A great sensory quote from this: I could feel panic nibbling at the edge of my mind with steel teeth. I had never felt so mortal. I think we all have at least one moment in our life, even if we weren't really in danger, where we thought for a split second we were, and we can relate to that so easily. But one of my favorites, living in New York City, as he's dealing with a pigeon that's pecking at his ankle up on that ledge. You get used to pigeons in the city. They're as common as cab drivers who won't change a 10. 13. Gray Matter. Kind of like the reverse of Battleground, Gray Matter is actually not one of my favorite stories, and this started lower on the list. But the more I thought about it, I think it has its literary merits. I don't know, this is where it felt right. Gray Matter was originally published in Cavalier magazine in the October issue of 1973. It was then turned into a 2019 television episode, another pilot episode, also similar to Battleground, but this time of Creep Show. Currently running on Shudder. I think it's going into its 4th season this year, if I'm not mistaken. And this adaptation of Gray Matter starred Tobin Bell, Jigsaw himself. Now, this is one of the first times we see this Stephen King trope of old men sitting in a bar or a corner store, and someone comes in, and these men, these old Mainers, have to help this person. In this instance, this kid comes in to buy some beer for his dad, but he's afraid to go home because his dad is turning into this predatory gray blob thing after drinking a beer that had some funky film on the top. It's a silly premise, and it's obviously this idea of kind of germs and bacteria at taking over, which is definitely resonant right now, coming off of COVID. I mean, we're still in COVID, but most everyone's vaccinated, and we're back to some semblance of normalcy again here going into spring of 2022. I guess in spring, but it's been freezing, so it feels like it's going into spring. But we've been in spring for like a month and a half now. It's kind of sad. There is a bird chirping in the tree outside, so that's nice. Spring, where are you? Gray Matter is a fairly straight narrative, but it builds suspense by withholding information very successfully. We're getting a first-person view from a guy that's kind of tagging along to help that was in the bar. But up front, the kid told the owner of the bar everything that was going on in a back room. So we only heard a little bit from the kid. Then we get this story doled out slowly for us as we're walking to the kid's apartment where the Gray Blob dad is. The story is just very intriguing. It keeps you guessing. It's one of those things that I did not like at first, but the more I sat with it, the more I thought, this is a really good fucking story. Especially with some of the language and the funny quotes I pulled out. Like, he looked like he just kissed the wrong end of a baby. And for those of you who have been watching these videos and have heard me mention Sean Ferrick, my Irish cutie who did the watch along for The Woman in the Room with me, there is this quote that I texted to Sean the minute I read it. The kid said it must have been the beer. You know how you can get a bad can every now and again. Flat or smelly or green as the pee stains in an Irishman's underwear. Sean laughed at that, but I'm not sure if he was mad at me or not. And then the threat. Just the threat of something that is out of our control. It was dividing, you see. Dividing in two. Bertie and I didn't say nothing to each other going back to the store. I don't know what was going through his mind, but I know well enough what was in mine. The multiplication table. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. 16 times 2 is... I was up to 32,768 times 2 is the end of the human race. And so we sat there. Number 12. Sometimes They Come Back. Now, Sometimes They Come Back is another one of my personal favorite stories, but there's some issues with the way it's written that I feel like I can't put it higher on this list. It's also another Dino De Laurentiis produced film, but this time a TV movie in 1991. It was originally supposed to be part of Cat's Eye, but De Laurentiis thought that it deserved a larger treatment, a more feature-length option, which he did, and I really liked it. I thought it was fun. It has some problems that it's very 90s, but it's fun. It starred Tim Matheson and was directed by Tom McLaughlin, and the story was originally published in Cavalier magazine, shock of all shocks, in March of 1974. In Sometimes They Come Back, Jim Norman is a young, new English teacher haunted by the memory of his brother's murder, which he witnessed when he was a kid at the hands of some greaser bullies, which, as we know, is going to become a Stephen King trope. We've already seen the greaser in Carrie. Now, unbelievably, as his current students meet unnatural ends or otherwise disappear for some reason, they are each being replaced in his class by new students identical to the bullies that killed his brother. Stephen King is very clearly examining the idea of battling personal demons here and how you can banish them. Not just let go of them, but banish these demons from your life. There are some things, some of the occult stuff that seems to come out of nowhere, but unlike the Mangler, which we talked about earlier, it's because the occult knowledge is learned rather than just suddenly known and given out. Our lead character goes and gets a book to learn about what might be happening. The way that this information is doled out, it builds suspense. It keeps us wondering, how is this happening? With nuggets of clues that tell us we're going to find out. We need to learn these answers. It drives our interest, but King's character building kind of splits the focus. It's a great character building and keeps us on edge in between these bits of information. And I'm not going to say that I enjoyed this story so much as I could relate to the story. We all have personal demons to different degrees, and we all wish we could get rid of them. I love this story. You gave me 16 years of bad dreams. Wasn't that enough? Why now? Why me? Vinny looked puzzled and then smiled again. Because you're unfinished business, man. 11. Jerusalem's Lot. Jerusalem's Lot was previously unpublished before the Night Shift collection, and then it was turned into a 2021 television series just last year called Chapelwaite. It was created by Peter and Jason Filardi, starred Adrian Brody and Emily Hampshire, and friends of the channel now, Jenny Raymond, who I've done an interview with, Sebastian LaBelle, who did one of these vlog watch-alongs with me for an adaptation of a Night Shift short story, Trina Corkum, who is a Patreon supporter. Thank you all. Season 2 of Chapelwaite, if you're interested, has been announced. I don't have official dates yet. All we know is it's going to continue the story that we already started. Jerusalem's Lot takes place in 1850, so does Chapelwaite, but here I'm talking about the short story, not the TV series. In the story, Charles Boone and his manservant, and maybe possibly closeted lover, move into the ancestral home Chapelwaite in the town of Preacher's Corners, which is near the ghost town of Jerusalem's Lot, which we'll visit in 1976 in Salem's Lot. As Charles Boone uncovers his family's dark secrets, supernatural tales from the townfolk seem more and more plausible. Stephen King has said that he set out to write an homage to Lovecraft, and that was the inspiration for Jerusalem's Lot, and that definitely holds true, especially with the Lovecraftian kind of twist at the ending that is well supported but comes out of nowhere at the same time. It's a fantastic ending, in my opinion, even if it's going to leave you scratching your head a bit. What we're exploring thematically are these curses or these traits that maybe get passed on through lineage, things like mental health problems or addiction. We're seeing a running theme in Stephen King's early work when it comes to addiction and mental health. Look at The Shining. I did a whole video on just the autobiographical nature of The Shining and Stephen King's alcoholism as a young father. But back to Jerusalem's Lot. The story is told in an epistolary style as Charles is writing letters in 1850. King attempts an 1850 kind of language. I don't want to say dialogue because it's these letters that we're writing. It's not quite consistent enough or believable enough to really pull me in. But he tried, A, for effort on that part. And these letters make the story very personal. And at one point we even change to Cal's viewpoint as we read his diary for just a short little while. So we get this break and this different view of what's happening that's kind of jarring and also enlightening. We get just enough of a lack of information to keep this intriguing, because if I'm writing a letter to my friend, I wouldn't include something you already know. I might reference it, but not explain it. And Stephen King does that very well in this story. If we want to tie it into Salem's Lot a little bit, people have called this a prequel. I would argue that Jerusalem's Lot is more of a companion piece than a prequel. It does deal with the same time of year leading up to All Hallows Eve, about the month before. Both the story and the novel Salem's Lot take place at that time, you know, a little over a century apart. And I will say there are vampires in Jerusalem's Lot without it being a vampire story. You kind of have to look closely for them. And there's definitely the recurring theme from Salem's Lot of haunted buildings or places rather than haunted people that are set forth in Salem's Lot with the Marston House. Those themes are very strong here. It's not my personal favorite story. I'm not a huge fan of that Lovecraftian ending, but I can appreciate it from a literary standpoint. It is very well written and very highly successful in what it sets out to do. Some of my favorite quotes, once you know the story, this is amazing. Anyone who would live in Chapelwaite must be either a lunatic or run the risk of becoming one. And thematically, there are spiritually noxious places, buildings where the milk of the cosmos has become sour and rancid. I am the last of the Boone blood. I fear that something knows this, and that I am at the nexus of an evil endeavor beyond all sane understanding. 10. One for the Road. One for the Road is also a piece that relates to Salem's Lot, but this is more a direct sequel that takes place 2 or 1 year later. There's kind of a weird timeline issue. I talk about that in the reading vlog if you want more details. But One for the Road, the short story, was originally published in Maine magazine in April of 1977. It was adapted into a number of short films over the years, but the one I watched for this channel was 2010 version written and directed by Paul Ward. One for the Road is about Gerard Lumley and his family. They get stranded in this snowbank driving through the burnt down town of Jerusalem's Lot 2-ish, 1 maybe, years after the events of the novel Salem's Lot. Jerry then walks 6 miles through a blizzard before finding Tukey's bar, where he enlists the help of some old Mainers to rescue his wife and daughter. There's that trope again. But these old Mainers have heard some stories about Jerusalem's Lot, and it gives them pause. We're definitely examining those themes in Salem's Lot of old world versus new. The continuation of the inspiration for Salem's Lot, where Stephen King says, what if Dracula came back present day? And we wouldn't believe the old myths because of new education and enlightenment and intelligence that we have. That advancements have banished these demons that may still exist in our world, and we just refuse to believe in them now. That is definitely on full display in the story One for the Road. One of my favorite stories, if I haven't said it yet already in this collection. This trope of the young father from out of town, the outsider, and the old Mainers, right? We see that dichotomy. Same thing with the superstition and the intellect. It's all over the place. Similar to Gray Matter, One for the Road is told from Booth's perspective, a patron that was in the bar when all of this went down. The old Maynard characterization and getting that internal monologue is on point. I will say that the story does possibly spit in the face of Salem's Lot, both because of the 1 versus 2 year confusion in the timeline, and also because the vampire transition timeline, everything takes a few days in Salem's Lot, and here it basically happens in a couple of hours. So that gave me a little bit of a pause, but ultimately it's just a fun story. I really enjoyed revisiting Salem's Lot because I already knew the full story and I knew the danger that this family was in. And now, as somebody who went to college in New Jersey and lives in New York, this quote is maybe one of my favorite, if not one of the most eloquent in the book. New Jersey. If there's anyone more purely foolish than a New Yorker, it's a fellow from New Jersey. And one of my favorite Stephen Kingisms that I found to date: Jesus jumped up Christ in a chariot-driven sidecar. 9. Graveyard Shift. Graveyard Shift was originally published in Cavalier magazine, again, in October of 1970. It was then turned into a 1990 film starring David Andrews, Stephen Mocht, and Brad Dourif. It was directed by Brian Singleton. The story of Graveyard Shift is this drifter that's kind of passing through town. He got a job at this industrial laundry, another Stephen King trope. It's something that he did himself, or somewhere that he worked. But this drifter is put in a group that's working over the week of 4th of July while the laundry is closed to clean out the basement. As they get further and further down into the basement levels, they discover colonies of mutated rats. Now, the theme here is actually worker exploitation. There's this college boy, as he's called by Warwick, the foreman, who's being used for the most menial of jobs and being made fun of for being educated. There's this theme of it happening over Independence Day, Revolution, right? The workers kind of, but not really, win in the end because they work together. It kind of shows unionization as revolutionizing workforce, or having the ability to revolutionize the workforce for the better of the human spirit. But ultimately, the story relies on the gross out factor. We feel and we identify with Hal's frustrations with Warwick and abuse and the idea of putting up with your boss in order to keep a job. And it's just so gross with the rats and everything they find in the basement that this story is going to sit with you in both a troubling and kind of a good, horrific way. He was thinking about Warwick and about the rats. Strange how the two things seem tied together. This ain't no kind of work for a man. 8. I Am the Doorway. I Am the Doorway was originally published in Cavalier magazine in March of 1971. I saw a couple of short films that were available. The only one I could find to actually watch all the way through was the 2010 short film written and directed by Levi Robinson. I Am the Doorway is about a retired astronaut who, in the near future, and that's near future to 1971, not today, he picks up an alien parasite while orbiting Venus that has been gestating in his system for years after he's returned. And now eyes are growing on his fingers, and this entity begins to control his body, and it's causing memory blackouts. Stephen King is really exploring the fear of the unknown and the sacrifices that we may have to make for advancement that maybe we shouldn't be making. There's really this feeling, I kind of imagine that Stephen King wrote this around the time of the moon landing, and he explored these fears of space exploration, but then it wasn't published until a couple of years later. It's pure sci-fi. There is a horror element, which often goes with sci-fi. It's well written. It jumps through time and place very successfully, including jumping to outer space. It is a very intriguing story, not my favorite. It's not really a genre that I find myself drawn to in literature. I love sci-fi television and film, just not something that I usually tend to read for some reason. I don't know why, but I can appreciate the story's appeal, and I can definitely appreciate the craft that it shows from a young Stephen King. It was a feeling like no other in the world, as if I were a portal, just slightly ajar, through which they were peeking at a world which they hated and feared. But the worst part was that I could see too, in a way. Imagine your mind transported into a body of a housefly looking into your own face with 1,000 eyes. 7. Children of the Corn. Children of the Corn, which I'm sure you have all heard of, was published originally in Penthouse magazine in March of 1977. Then in 1984, it was turned into a feature-length film starring Peter Horton and Linda Hamilton, directed by Fritz Kirsch, which spawned an entire film franchise, which I'm going to be going through and doing audio commentary for over on the Patreon channel very soon. The story, as it is in the short story, not as it is in the film, although it's fairly faithful, except for... So basic premise, Bert and Vicky are traveling cross-country on a road trip vacation, and this is a vacation that is actually a last-ditch effort to save their troubled marriage. On the way, driving through Nebraska, they get off the highway, they're surrounded by cornfields, and they just run over a kid who seems to run or fall out of the corn on the side of the highway in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. They discover Gatlin, a small town that has been taken over by zealous children who worship he who walks behind the road. This story, I'm really going to the troubled marriage for its theme. The idea is the grass is always greener on the other side, but is it really? And the idea of wondering, how could my life be different if I had made a different choice? It's like someone said to Stephen King, well, it couldn't be worse than it is now. And Stephen King came back with, oh yeah? Read this. The relationship between Bert and Vicky is relatable. We all have people that we don't get along with. It doesn't have to be a spouse that you're on the rocks with where the marriage is about to end. But we've all been through breakups in the past. The gender roles, the stereotypes, they may not have aged quite so well. I do think the story still holds up. I don't think that's much of an issue. We do empathize with Bert, even though Vicky's characterization is very problematic as just that whining woman. But there's an argument to be made that we're seeing this through Bert's point of view, and this is how he is seeing the person that is annoying him. So I don't mind that quite so much. The story itself is intriguing. It's suspenseful. There is this great twist at the ending that you're not expecting, and it is not what happens in the movie. One of my favorite quotes, the wind rustled softly through the growing man-high corn, making a weird sound like respiration. 6. The Boogeyman. The Boogeyman was originally published, shock of shocks again, Cavalier magazine, in a March 1973 issue. The story was turned into a short film in 1982, which then was grouped with another short story that we're going to get to later in this list, into a 1995 VHS that you could buy called The Night Shift Collection. The short film starred Michael Earl Reed, and it was written and directed by Jeff Shiro. There is a new feature-length film in the works. There is no release date, but it was recently announced that it was going to star Sophie Thatcher, who was recently in Yellow Jackets, and Chris Messina, who is just so damn sexy and a great actor, and I love him. I have ever since he was in the last season of 6 Feet Under. I wish he would have dumped Claire and married me. And the adaptation is going to be directed by Rob Savage. Now, I will say that the film, from the kind of synopsis in the press release, doesn't seem like it's going to be very faithful to the original source material. However, the short film from 1982 definitely is. The story is about Lester Billings. He has lost all 3 of his children to mysterious nighttime events like crib death, for example. And he notices at each death that the closet door is slightly ajar, and he has a theory that maybe the Boogeyman is responsible for killing his children. So now he goes to a therapist's office and he says, I just want to tell you about this. You're not going to believe me. I need to get it off my chest and I'm going to go. And then we get this story, this stream of consciousness flow as he sits in a therapist's office. And every now and then the doctor will ask him some questions that keep us on track. We're definitely exploring the fear and the guilt of fatherhood, the guilt of what something I may have done wrong or perceived to have done wrong as a father, and the fear of doing things wrong and fucking up your children. In the late 60s, early 70s, the time that Stephen King was writing all of the short stories in Night Shift, he was graduating college and settling down with Tabitha and becoming a father. So we're getting all of this here. The story is just really eerie and creepy, and there's these real elements like truth in the midst of this craziness that we know can't be true. And I want to point to one thing that really rounds this out and makes it feel real is Lester's characterization. We hate Lester. He's a misogynist, he's arrogant, he's racist, but ultimately we empathize with him nonetheless. I mean, he is a dad who's fathered 3 children, all of who have been murdered. Okay? Even if we think he never should have fathered children, we empathize with him, especially when he says, I didn't like to open the closet door anymore. I kept thinking, well, what if it's in there? 5. Night Surf. Night Surf was originally published in an issue of Cavalier in August of 1974. It was also turned into, again, a number of short films, but the one that I watched for this channel was a 2015 short written and directed by Tony Pomfret. The story is about a group of young adults, kind of college-age kids, who find themselves on the beach and on the boardwalk of the seaside town one night. They seem to be virtually the only people left in the area after a super flu called A6, or also called Captain Trips, has killed the vast majority of the population. But now one of them, all believing they're immune, might be starting to get sick. King is exploring end of the world and apocalyptic themes here. I actually read in my Stephen King companion that he was playing around with the idea here while still in college when he wrote this, that ended up turning into the book The Stand a decade later, or not quite, almost a decade later. But what intrigues me is that he clarifies that the super flu comes out of Southeast Asia. And I do wonder if that was inspired by Vietnam at all, if that's allegory. When we finally get to The Stand, and I know we skipped The Stand in readathon order, it's because I'm going to the complete and uncut edition that came out in the early 90s. I'm going to read it at that place in the publication. I'm going to read it at that place in the publication order readathons. But yeah, so knowing that Stephen King was very outspoken about Vietnam and that this super flu came out of Southeast Asia, it made me wonder. The short story Night Surf is told in first-person narration from Bernie. Bernie is very level-headed, but he's also very frustrated with his girlfriend. It's a little hard to read, like Lester from the Boogeyman, but easier to handle because Bernie keeps calling Susie fat, but he's not quite misogynistic or body-shaming. It's just this idea of the repulsion of someone that I don't really like anymore and would have broken up with. And I'm a teenager, so I think in these terms of things that are physical and primal and horny. I'm kind of stuck with her now because of this situation of being the last, 5 people on Earth. There's some really cool nonchalant body horror right at the beginning that's just kind of thrown away, and that's what makes it horrific. I love the way this story starts. What I will say overall is that this is the most sensory story in the entire collection. From the sound of the surf coming in on the beach to the memory of this bustling boardwalk. The language in Night Surf is some of the most beautiful in the entire collection that we're discussing today. The opening line, tell me this doesn't hook you immediately. After the guy was dead and the smell of his burning flesh was off the air, we all went back down to the beach. What the fuck? I'm in. And then the whole thing ends with this very I was about to say sensual, but I meant sensory, but sensual could be the right word. The surf was coming in, coming in, coming in. Limitless, clean and deep. We had come here in summer, Maureen and I. The summer after high school, the summer before college and reality and A6 coming out of Southeast Asia and covering the world like a pall. July, we had eaten pizza and listened to her radio. I had put oil on her back and she had put oil on mine. The air had been hot, the sand bright, the sun like a burning glass. Oh, can't you just smell the ocean and feel the burn of the pepperoni pizza on the roof of your mouth and the oil on your back? And oh my God, I love the sensory imagery in Night Surf. Number 4, Strawberry Spring. Now, Strawberry Spring is one of those that I would, at a gut reaction, put much further down on the list, but upon reflection, it is so well written, and the story has stuck with me. So here we are. We're in the top 5. Number 4 is Strawberry Spring. It was originally published by Cavalier Magazine in November of 1975, and then just last year, in 2021, actually airing at the same time as Chapelwaite, was the podcast starring Garrett Hedlund and Milo Ventimiglia. It was written and directed by Lee Metzger, and it is the first ever podcast adaptation of a Stephen King work. I don't know if there's a second season. I have seen nothing announced about it one way or the other, but the story is left open. Henry wakes up one morning in 1976. It's a foggy strawberry spring, and there's a story on the news about the seeming return of serial killer Spring Heel Jack. He was last seen in 1968 when he murdered a string of young women on the campus of New Sharon Teachers College, where Henry was actually a student. And then in 1968, when Strawberry Spring was over, Spring Heel Jack disappeared. There's this really cool reference to the Zodiac Killer. It's barely there in the story, but it's enough to understand how this story may have been inspired. And it really captures the idea of a small community. Here, it's a college campus, a small community college campus. But we get this later on in Stephen King with the small towns in Cary or in Salem's Lot just being terrorized and gripped with fear. And we come to know this as a Stephen King trope. And here it is in one of his earliest written stories. And he does it so well. I think thematically we're also exploring the fear of the subconscious. I don't want to say too much about that. I think that's left for you to get as you read the story. I don't want to spoil anything. The story does move quickly, and the murders get progressively more and more elaborate. So there's always a new piece of this puzzle that we're trying to figure out, but nothing that gives away the ending. But there are enough clues in there that when you go back and read it a second time, you go, oh, of course, there it is. It was right there in front of me. Duh. Again, just like Night Surf, there's a lot of great imagery. This is more visual and kind of eerie, creepy sensory imagery, all about the fog, that it is all five of your senses like Night Surf. But the imagery is so great. I mean, just look at this. It was Strawberry Spring, and no one walked by themselves through the half-academical, half-fantastical campus that night. The fog had come again, smelling of the sea, quiet and deep. And one of my favorite quotes in the entire Night Shift collection, I passed many shadows, heard many footfalls clicking dreamily off down the winding paths. Who is to say that one of those shadows was not the man or the thing that came to be known as Spring Heel Jack? Not I, for I passed many shadows, but in the fog I saw no faces. Or this, she had slipped on campus as silently and as easily as Spring Heel Jack himself. What brought her? Perhaps her need was as deep and as ungovernable as her killer's, and just as far beyond understanding. Maybe a need for one desperate and passionate romance with the warm night, the warm fog, the smell of the sea, and the cold knife. 3. The Man Who Loved Flowers. The Man Who Loved Flowers is another one that my gut reaction was to put it much, much further down on the list. But the more it sat with me and the more I kind of examined it and thought about it, this is a really great story. The Man Who Loved Flowers was originally published in Gallery magazine in August of 1977. It was turned into a number of short films as well, but I watched the 2010 short film written and directed by Christopher Harrison. It is a beautiful spring day in the short story. It is May of 1963. A young man is walking up 3rd Avenue in Midtown of New York City. He is obviously in love, and everyone he passes has to think or make comment on it. He stops to buy flowers for Norma, the young woman he's going to meet, but it is never, ever Norma. And that's all I'm going to say about that. I love that Stephen King set this in 1963. The country is right on the brink of change, upheaval. I think this is about Stephen King wanting to examine the times, that everything seemed beautiful and hunky-dory, but boiling under the surface, we had the civil rights movement. We had the war in Vietnam. The 60s, the late 60s and the 70s was just such a time of social and political change in our country that setting the story back in 1963 really captures the spirit of the times at the brink of change. This hippie, free love culture in the streets with the political turmoil and the war overseas, which in the story is just subtly mentioned as a situation that would bear watching, if that gives you kind of time frame here. The language is perfectly romantic. It's floral, even, if you'll forgive the pun there. It's flowery. There's this romantic tone that very subtly is undercut by this tumultuous climate change. There's this brief mention that we talked about with Vietnam and some other things, just this voice on the radio announcing things that we should be worried about that you forget almost as soon as you read. And then at the end, all of that supports the story taking this hard left that comes out of nowhere. And at first I thought, what the was that? That was stupid. And the more I sat with it, the more I thought it was necessary. One of my favorite quotes about the man and people being in love: his complexion was fair and his eyes a light blue. Not an extraordinary face, but on this soft spring evening, on this avenue, in May of 1963, he was beautiful. And the old woman found herself thinking with a moment's sweet nostalgia that in spring, anyone can be beautiful. Number 2, the last rung on the ladder. Or maybe number 1, because these really kind of tie for me, and I had a really, really hard time deciding how to place these. So on the day that I wrote this outline, this was number 2, and it feels right today, so we're going to stick with it. 2, the last rung on the ladder. This is the second story that was previously unpublished in this collection. I've heard that there's a short film being made, and I'm very nervous because I love this story. It might be one of my favorite things Stephen King has ever written. I really, really hope that there is a decent, well-acted, superbly directed version of this coming out, because I would love to see it, although that might be the wrong word because the story is very troubling. So let me get into the premise. Upon returning home from his sister's funeral, Larry receives a letter that was mailed before she even died, asking for help. She committed suicide. And reading this letter that has just now arrived at his house, it makes Larry remember the time Katrina and he were playing a game as children in the barn, and this old rickety ladder that they're climbing up breaks, and it leaves Katrina just hanging from a rung almost 70 feet in the air. This is very much about the fear of failure and abandoning your responsibilities to the people you love and the people who love you. It's about families splitting. It's about not living up to expectations. And for anyone who has ever felt like they let someone down, this story is more than relatable. The root of this is about what happens when you lose touch with the people that you love simply because life happened and you parted ways for a little while. So did I enjoy this story? Enjoy here is most assuredly not the right word. I felt this story. I related to it. I rooted for our characters. I cheered when they won. I cried when they won, and I cried harder when they lost. I felt shame for identifying with Larry's situation. The story is visceral. Just like we got with The Ledge, we have the height issue happening again, the fear, but also the feelings, the emotions that Larry is going through, and this immediacy that we get from the first person narrative that's being heightened by these emotions because in present day, he has just lost his sister and in the throes of grief. And what we're looking back through the memory, we're looking through the lens of a childhood memory, and as children, our emotions are heightened. When we are afraid, we are afraid. This story is just so fucking good. And it opens, this isn't the first sentence, but right near the beginning, it was addressed to Wilmington, Delaware, and I'd moved twice since then. People moved around so much now, and it's funny how those crossed off addresses and change of address stickers can look like accusations. Keep in mind that this was written before cell phones, before email. If you wanted to talk to someone, you had to pay to call long distance, and not a lot of people could afford that. Hi, Bruni. Yes, I am emotional, and I need you right now. You had to write letters to people and wait for them to be mailed. And then, word for word, again, at the very end of the short story, we get repeated, people move around so much now, and it's funny how those crossed off addresses and change of address stickers can look like accusations. I've been awake all night with it, with Katrina's letter. She could have put it on a postcard. There was only a single sentence below the Dear Larry, but a sentence can mean enough. It can do enough. 1. The Woman in the Room. The Woman in the Room is the final story in the collection. It is also the final story that was previously unpublished of the 3 that never appeared anywhere before the Night Shift collection. And then in 1983, Frank Darabont, a young Frank Darabont, wrote Stephen King and asked if he could make a short film out of it, which gave birth to the Dollar Baby program. It's why there are so many short films based on Stephen King stories, because young filmmakers can afford to adapt them. They can get the rights. The short film starred Michael Cornelison, Dee Croxton, Brian Libby, and it was the second movie, well, the first in order, but the second movie included in the Night Shift movie collection that we talked about, the other being The Boogeyman. This story is very, very personal to Stephen King, and you feel it right from the beginning. The premise is that Johnny's mother, Johnny is our main character, she has stomach cancer, and between the cancer itself and the different treatments, she is now partially paralyzed. She's losing her faculties. She is in a great deal of cattail pain. His mother is in a great deal of pain, and now Johnny must decide whether or not to help her with an assisted suicide that she may or may not have directly asked for. We're looking at someone's personal struggle here, their most private thoughts about a horrific situation. One of the worst places one can find themselves in. It is autobiographical in nature. Stephen King was dealing with his own mother's death shortly before he wrote this story from cancer. And right from the very beginning, I mean, the first sentence, for God's sake, of the whole story is, the question is, can he do it? I'm immediately pulled in with, can he do what? What is it he can do? I think there's a cat ear in my shot. From a literary standpoint, it pulls us right in. And then there's this beautifully broken structure where we reach the end of a paragraph and a sentence just stops midway and picks up after a break in the page. And we're in a different location and the thought is shifting, but it just gives us this idea that he's being haunted no matter where he is, no matter what he's doing. Johnny can't stop thinking about what's going on with his mom, so neither can we. It captures the feeling of the never-ending internal monologues that we have as human beings. There are some allusions to other pieces of literature and authors. At first, I thought it was a little bit of a young writer issue like we had with the Lawn Mower Man, but I'm going to argue that these are authors that his mother encouraged him to read. So I think that they were very well thought out, very carefully planted, not overdone. By putting in these allusions to our real world and these authors, by having the breaks on the page, there's this Brechtian element that makes us stop and really think about what we're seeing. Why is it structured this way visually? And that makes the story just so much more resonant, so much more disturbing, I think, because we can really put ourselves into Johnny's shoes. So again, I'm going to say it's not that I enjoyed this story. It's not the right word, but I was completely 100% from the first sentence enveloped in this story. The one quote that will always, always, always stick with me from this book is from the telephone call that Johnny has with his brother, Kevin, and Kevin wants to pull her out of the hospital, and his argument to Johnny is, John, she's dying. She's not dead yet. This, in fact, is what horrifies him. The conversation will go around in circles from here, the profits accruing to the telephone company. But this is the nub. Not dead yet. Well, guys, I know that's kind of a somber note to end on, and I usually go right to thanks for watching. So I'm going to try to beef this up a little bit for you. As I say, thank you so much for tuning in to this video, for checking out my personal rankings of the stories in the Night Shift collection published in 1978 by Stephen King. Did you guys agree with me? Do you think it should be a different order? Which stories do you think should be higher on the list or lower? Leave me a comment down below. And while you're doing that, go ahead and like the video, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet already. It's a very little thing for you, but it really helps me out as a new channel. And if you want to follow me or the Crazy Cats on any social media or support the channel via Patreon, you can do that via the links down below. I will see you guys next time, which is when we're finally getting into The Long Walk. I can't fucking wait.